The F-22 Raptors screamed across the Nevada desert in perfect formation, their stealth profiles cutting through the morning air like invisible daggers. At Nellis Air Force Base's Red Flag exercise, these fifth-generation fighters represented the absolute pinnacle of American air superiority technology, piloted by the most elite aviators the Air Force could produce. But on this scorching Tuesday morning in September, none of them were prepared for what Captain Sarah Mitchell was about to teach them about the art of warfare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The flight line at Nellis buzzed with the controlled chaos that marked the beginning of another red flag exercise, the most demanding air combat training program in the world. Maintenance crews swarmed around aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars, while pilots conducted final briefings for missions that would push both man and machine to their absolute limits. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, where the sleek silhouettes of F-22 Raptors dominated the landscape like technological predators waiting to be unleashed. Captain Sarah Mitchell walked across this same tarmac carrying a worn flight bag that had seen better days, her flight suit bearing the patches of multiple deployments that told stories most people would never hear. At first glance, she looked like someone who might have wandered onto the wrong flight line by mistake. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation bun that had probably been the same style for years, and her boots showed the kind of wear that came from countless hours of pre-flight inspections and post-mission debriefs. She moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had learned that in aviation, rushing usually led to mistakes that could prove fatal. What caught the attention of the F-22 pilots gathering near the squadron building wasn't just her unremarkable appearance, though it certainly contrasted with their perfectly pressed flight suits and immaculate equipment. It was the aircraft she was walking toward that drew stares and poorly concealed amusement from across the flight line. Parked at the far end of the ramp, looking like a relic from a different era of warfare, sat an A-10 Thunderbolt II that appeared to have been through every conflict since its introduction decades earlier. The aircraft's titanium bathtub cockpit was scarred and patched in places where maintenance crews had repaired battle damage from previous deployments. The twin engines mounted high on the fuselage showed the kind of wear that came from operating in environments where debris and small arms fire were occupational hazards. Compared to the pristine F-22s with their radar-absorbing coatings and cutting-edge avionics, Sarah's A-10 looked like a farm truck parked next to a fleet of sports cars. Major Ryan Stevens, the squadron's most decorated F-22 pilot, was the first to voice what everyone was thinking as he adjusted his flight gear near the briefing room entrance. He nudged his wingman and nodded towards Sarah's position with the kind of expression usually reserved for observing traffic accidents. "What is that thing doing in a red flag exercise? I thought this was supposed to be advanced air combat training, not a museum exhibit." His voice carried across the tarmac louder than he probably intended, drawing chuckles from the other pilots who had gathered to watch the spectacle. Sarah's expression didn't change as she continued her methodical pre-flight inspection, running her hands along the aircraft's surfaces and checking systems with movements that spoke of deep familiarity earned through thousands of flight hours. She seemed completely oblivious to the attention she was drawing, focused entirely on her aircraft with the kind of concentration that suggested this ritual was as natural as breathing. Her inspection routine included checks that weren't part of standard procedures, examining components and systems that told stories of lessons learned in places where mechanical failure meant more than just mission abort. Captain Jessica Park, one of only 3 female pilots in the F-22 squadron, felt a mixture of embarrassment and concern watching the older pilot prepare her aircraft. Jessica had fought hard to earn respect in a field where women faced scrutiny that men rarely experienced, and seeing another woman show up with equipment that looked like it belonged in an air museum made her cringe. Someone should probably tell her this isn't an air show demonstration, Jessica whispered to her flight lead. This is serious combat training where seconds matter and technology saves lives. The buzz of conversation around the flight line grew louder as more pilots noticed Sarah and her ancient aircraft. Some pulled out phones to take pictures, already composing social media posts about the antique warbird that had somehow gotten clearance to participate, alongside the most advanced fighters in the American inventory. Others shook their heads in disgust, viewing her presence as disrespectful to the serious nature of training that prepared them for real combat against peer adversaries. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Harrison, the Red Flag exercise director overseeing the day's operations, approached Sarah's aircraft with a clipboard and a diplomatic expression that barely concealed his skepticism. At 45, Harrison had managed some of the most complex air operations in recent military history, from no-fly zone enforcement to close air support missions in multiple theaters. He'd seen every type of pilot imaginable, from cocky rookies to grizzled veterans, but he'd never encountered someone quite like Captain Mitchell. "Captain," he said, his voice professional but tinged with concern, "I need to verify your mission authorization and aircraft specifications. This is a highly complex training exercise with specific requirements for participant aircraft and pilot." "Qualifications." "Sarah Mitchell," she interrupted quietly, handing him a folder without looking up from her inspection of the A-10's GAU-8 cannon. "My paperwork should be in order, sir." Harrison opened the folder and began scanning the documents inside, finding authorization forms that bore signatures from levels of command he rarely encountered during routine training exercises. The pilot qualification codes were unlike anything in his standard database, with references to specialized programs and combat experience that weren't part of normal Air Force documentation. There were certifications for close air support operations in environments that officially didn't exist, and flight hours logged in aircraft configurations that weren't acknowledged in public records. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "These certifications," Harrison said slowly, still studying the papers with growing confusion. "Some of these programs aren't in our current training database. Where exactly did you complete this specialized instruction?" Sarah finally looked up, meeting his gaze with calm blue eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience he couldn't quite place. "Various locations, sir. Different theaters of operation over the years. When you're flying close air support missions, you learn to adapt your techniques to whatever the situation requires." The vagueness of her response only added to Harrison's confusion, but the paperwork was undeniably legitimate, complete with official seals and authorization codes that checked out when he ran them through the secure communication systems. Whatever Sarah's background, someone with serious authority had approved her participation in Red Flag, and that someone operated at levels where questioning decisions could be career-limiting. As word spread about the mysterious pilot with the museum piece aircraft, more aviators drifted over to observe her preparation routine. What they saw defied their expectations in ways that were hard to articulate. Despite the A-10's obvious age and battle-worn appearance, Sarah handled her pre-flight inspection with a familiarity that bordered on reverence, checking and adjusting components with the confidence of someone who knew every rivet and wire intimately. Her flight bag contained equipment that was as outdated as the aircraft itself. Instead of modern electronic flight planning systems and digital navigation aids, she had hand-annotated charts covered in plastic sleeves, a worn logbook filled with decades of handwritten entries, and a collection of backup instruments that looked like they'd been salvaged from aircraft graveyards. Everything about her setup screamed amateur hour, yet there was something about the way she organized and handled her equipment that suggested otherwise. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the Nevada desert into a furnace that sent heat waves shimmering across the runway. Modern aircraft equipped with advanced cooling systems and climate-controlled. Cockpits were already showing signs of thermal stress, but Sarah's battle-tested A-10 seemed immune to such concerns. She'd positioned herself in whatever shade the aircraft provided, moving with an economy of motion that suggested she'd learned to conserve energy in much harsher conditions than a Nevada training range. Nellis Air Force Base represented the pinnacle of modern air combat training infrastructure, sprawling across thousands of acres of Nevada desert that had been transformed into the most sophisticated military aviation complex in the world. Facility featured electronic warfare ranges capable of simulating any threat environment on Earth, air-to-air combat areas equipped with the latest radar and missile simulation systems, and ground targets that could replicate everything from armored vehicles to surface-to-air missile sites with scientific precision. This wasn't a place where weekend warriors came to play pilot. Nellis hosted exercises that determined assignments to elite fighter squadrons, selected candidates for test pilot programs, and validated the skills of aviators whose decisions could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Every pilot here had earned their place through demonstrated excellence, advanced training, and proven performance under conditions that would break most people. The F-22 pilots who dominated this environment represented the cream of American aviation. They flew aircraft that cost more than most nations' entire defense budgets, equipped with radar systems developed by the finest aerospace engineers and weapons that could engage targets beyond visual range with unprecedented accuracy. Their helmet-mounted displays provided information that would have seemed like science fiction just a generation earlier, while their aircraft stealth capabilities allowed them to operate in airspace that would be lethal to conventional fighters. Major Ryan Stevens had invested 8 years and countless hours building his reputation as one of the Air Force's premier F-22 pilots. His aircraft featured modifications that had been tested in classified programs, avionics that incorporated lessons learned from conflicts in multiple theaters, and weapon systems that represented the cutting edge of air-to-air combat technology. His helmet alone cost more than most people's cars and featured targeting capabilities that could lock onto enemy aircraft before they even knew he was in the area. Captain Jessica Park's equipment represented the latest in aviation innovation, incorporating technologies that had been developed through partnerships between military, research facilities, and civilian aerospace companies. Her flight suit contained environmental systems that could keep her comfortable and alert during missions lasting many hours, while her aircraft's sensor fusion capabilities provided situational awareness that previous generations of pilots could never have imagined. The hierarchy at Nellis was as precisely calibrated as the weapon systems its pilots carried. Rank determined not just respect and authority, but access to the most advanced aircraft and the latest technological developments. Exercise results here influenced career trajectories, determined special assignment opportunities, and opened doors to programs that existed at the very edges of what the Air Force acknowledged publicly. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison embodied this system's values and expectations. He'd earned his position through 22 years of distinguished service, including tours with special operations units where aviation skills were measured not in training scores but in lives saved and missions accomplished. His office walls displayed photographs with generals and congressmen, commendations from presidents, and certificates recognizing achievements that remained classified years after their completion. The pilots training under Harrison's supervision understood that their time at Nellis represented an opportunity that might never come again. Selection for advanced fighter programs was limited to a handful of candidates each year, chosen not just for their flying ability but for their mental toughness, adaptability, and capacity to perform under conditions that would overwhelm most people. Competition here was fierce, professional, and absolutely unforgiving. Sarah's presence disrupted this carefully orchestrated environment in ways that went beyond mere incongruity. Her casual approach to preparation seemed to mock the intense professionalism that defined Red Flag's culture. While other pilots obsessed over minute details of mission planning and aircraft configuration, she appeared content to sit quietly with her outdated equipment, occasionally making notes in her worn logbook, but otherwise showing no signs of the anxiety or focused intensity that characterized serious combat aviation. The aircraft systems surrounding Sarah represented hundreds of millions of dollars in research, development, and manufacturing precision. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon had invested decades perfecting technologies that could extend engagement ranges, reduce radar signatures, and provide reliability under conditions that would destroy conventional equipment. The avionics alone on some aircraft incorporated features that seemed like science fiction just 20 years earlier. Range conditions at Nellis tested both equipment and operators to their limits. Desert thermals could create turbulence that challenged even the most sophisticated flight control systems, while electronic warfare environments replicated threats that could overwhelm pilots who hadn't trained extensively in such conditions. The facility's proximity to multiple mountain ranges added navigation challenges that required constant adaptation and recalculation of flight parameters. The electronic monitoring systems observing each aircraft provided real-time feedback with scientific precision, measuring not just performance but consistency, timing, and split-second variations that revealed the subtle differences between good pilots and exceptional ones. Data from these systems fed into databases that tracked performance trends, identified training requirements, and provided objective measures of capability that eliminated subjective evaluation from the selection process. This technological sophistication created an environment where marginal gains mattered enormously. An aircraft system that delivered slightly better radar resolution could mean the difference between mission success and failure. Equipment that performed consistently across varying conditions provided advantages that often determined final rankings. The pilots competing here understood that their careers might hinge on performance margins, measured in milliseconds and nautical miles. Major Ryan Stevens commanded respect wherever he went at Nellis, and he knew it. At 34, he stood 6 feet tall with the kind of build that came from years of military fitness standards and the confidence that accompanied being recognized as one of the Air Force's premier fighter pilots. His flight suit displayed patches that told the story of multiple combat deployments and training programs that had pushed him to his limits, while his bearing suggested someone who had never encountered an aviation challenge he couldn't master. Stevens had earned his position through dedication that bordered on obsession and a natural ability that his instructors had recognized early in his career. His flying scores consistently ranked in the top 1% of all Air Force pilots, and his record included air-to-air victories, achieved under conditions that made other aviators shake their heads in disbelief. He'd been featured in recruitment videos, interviewed by aviation magazines, and selected for specialized programs that existed at the very edges of what the military acknowledged publicly. The F-22 Raptor Stevens flew represented 3 years of meticulous customization and testing. Every component had been selected based on extensive analysis of combat performance data, environmental resistance, and reliability under conditions that would challenge any aircraft system. His helmet-mounted display alone had cost the Air Force $200,000 and incorporated targeting technology that could engage multiple threats simultaneously with accuracy that previous generations of fighters couldn't approach. But it wasn't just Stevens' equipment that commanded attention among his peers. It was his attitude and proven track record. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never encountered an air combat scenario he couldn't dominate, a mission he couldn't complete, or a competitor he couldn't outperform. Other pilots sought his advice, deferred to his expertise, and considered assignment to his flight teams to be career-enhancing opportunities that opened doors throughout the aviation community. Captain Jessica Park represented a different but equally formidable presence in the squadron. At 29, she had fought harder than most of her male counterparts to earn recognition in a field where women faced skepticism and scrutiny that men rarely experienced. Her flying scores didn't just meet male standards. They exceeded them by margins that silenced critics and earned grudging respect from aviators, who had initially questioned her presence in fighter aircraft. Park's aircraft featured modifications that reflected both her technical expertise and her determination to leave no advantage unexploited. Her F-22 incorporated lessons learned from conflicts where split-second decisions determined survival, while her flight planning methodology combined scientific precision with intuitive understanding of air combat dynamics that couldn't be taught. In simulators, the respect Park had earned came at a cost that her male counterparts rarely understood. Every mistake she made was scrutinized more heavily, every success attributed to luck or superior equipment rather than skill, and every training opportunity required her to prove herself worthy in ways that men took for granted. She had learned to be not just good but exceptional, because anything less would be interpreted as confirmation that women didn't belong in fighter cockpits. Lieutenant Marcus Johnson had built his reputation on an ability to identify weaknesses in opposing aircraft and exploit them ruthlessly during training exercises. At 32, he possessed the kind of tactical intelligence that came from years of studying air combat dynamics, threat analysis, and human psychology under the stress of high-speed maneuvering. Johnson could observe another pilot's techniques for 10 minutes and identify subtle flaws that would become magnified under combat conditions, causing performance degradation when it mattered most. Johnson's flight bag contained more than just standard equipment. It held psychological tools designed to unsettle competitors and create advantages that went beyond pure flying ability. He knew exactly when to make casual comments about weather conditions that would plant seeds of doubt in other pilots' minds, how to position his aircraft to create subtle distractions during critical mission phases, and which topics of conversation would reveal insecurities that could be exploited during competitive exercises. The pilots surrounding Sarah represented years of competitive flying experience at the highest levels. They had faced each other in countless training scenarios, analyzed each other's strengths and weaknesses, and developed strategies for gaining microscopic advantages that could determine mission outcomes. They knew each other's aircraft capabilities, flying preferences, and mental vulnerabilities with the thoroughness of chess masters studying familiar opponents. Captain David Brooks brought 12 years of special operations experience to every exercise he participated in. His background included assignments that remained classified years after their completion, training programs that existed only in Pentagon budget lines that few people had clearance to read, and missions that had required flying skills under conditions that made controlled training environments seem like recreational activities. Brooks carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had used his aircraft for purposes more serious than training exercises, who understood the difference between flying for scores and flying for survival. His equipment showed signs of hard use rather than careful maintenance, suggesting a philosophy that prioritized reliability and familiarity over technical perfection and aesthetic appeal. The culture these pilots had created valued innovation, technological advancement, and relentless pursuit of marginal improvements that could provide competitive advantages. They discussed aircraft modifications with the intensity of Formula One engineers, debated aviation theories with academic precision, and approached training with methodologies borrowed from Olympic sports programs and cognitive psychology research. Sarah's presence violated every assumption this culture was built upon. Her obvious age suggested declining reflexes and vision that would handicap performance at supersonic speeds. Her outdated aircraft indicated either ignorance of modern developments or inability to access equipment that serious fighter pilots considered essential. Her casual demeanor implied a lack of understanding about the intensity and importance of the training exercise she had entered. The pilots watching Sarah prepare for the morning's mission saw confirmation of their superiority in every aspect of her appearance and behavior. They possessed faster aircraft, superior training, advanced understanding of air combat tactics, and the physical advantages that came from military conditioning and youth. The idea that this woman could challenge their dominance seemed not just unlikely, but impossible. The first official briefing session began at precisely 0630 hours in the Red Flag Operations Center, where pilots gathered around digital displays, showing the day's mission parameters and threat environments. Sarah settled into a seat at the back of the room, her weathered flight bag resting beside chairs occupied by aviators whose combined equipment value exceeded the cost of a luxury yacht. The contrast was immediately apparent to everyone present. To her left, Captain Park was methodically reviewing digital mission data on a tablet that featured real-time threat analysis and weather updates fed directly from satellite systems. To her right, Lieutenant Johnson was running final calculations on his mission computer, muttering airspeed and altitude estimates under his breath while cross-referencing multiple data sources. Sarah's preparation routine drew immediate attention for all the wrong reasons. While other pilots spent 20 minutes analyzing computerized threat assessments and automated flight planning solutions, she simply opened her worn leather mission folder and began making handwritten notes on charts that appeared to have been photocopied from manuals published during the Reagan administration. The contrast was stark and unmistakable. High-tech digital displays versus what appeared to be grocery store notebooks and pencil stubs that looked like they'd survived multiple wars. "Good Lord," Stephen said loud enough for Sarah to hear, gesturing toward her antiquated materials. "Are those actual paper charts, or are you planning to navigate by reading tea leaves and chicken bones?" His comment triggered a ripple of laughter throughout the briefing room. Several pilots turned to get a better look at Sarah's setup, their expressions ranging from amusement to outright disbelief at what they were witnessing. Sarah's A-10 technical specifications, when displayed on the briefing room screens, only reinforced the perception that she was completely out of her depth. The aircraft's maximum speed of 450 knots seemed glacial compared to the F-22s that routinely exceeded Mach 2 in afterburner. Her service ceiling of 45,000 feet was dwarfed by the Raptors that could climb to altitudes where the sky turned black and atmospheric pressure approached vacuum conditions. The comparison charts made her aircraft appear hopelessly outclassed in every measurable category. But perhaps most telling were the weapon systems comparisons that dominated the morning briefing displays. While the F-22s carried AIM-120 missiles, capable of engaging targets at distances exceeding 100 nautical miles, Sarah's A-10 was equipped with what the briefing materials diplomatically described as legacy ordnance designed for close-range engagements. The GA-U-8 cannon that formed the centerpiece of her aircraft's design seemed almost primitive compared to the beyond visual range capabilities that her competitors possessed. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison couldn't resist commenting on the disparity during his mission overview presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen, today's exercise will test your ability to operate in a complex threat environment where split-second decisions and technological superiority determine mission outcomes. Some aircraft," he said with a meaningful glance towards Sarah, "will face additional challenges due to performance limitations that may affect their ability to contribute meaningfully to overall mission success." Sarah continued making notes in her logbook, apparently oblivious to the growing chorus of comments directed her way. She consulted hand-drawn tactical diagrams that looked like something a military history professor might have sketched for lecture about World War II air operations, then made additional calculations using methods that predated the computerized systems her competitors relied upon for mission planning. "I've seen crop dusters with more sophisticated navigation equipment," Park whispered to her flight lead loud enough to ensure Sarah could hear. "Someone needs to explain that this isn't a vintage aircraft demonstration. We're training for combat. Scenarios where technological inferiority gets people killed." The comment drew approving nods from nearby pilots who were beginning to view Sarah's presence as an insult to the serious nature of their preparation. When the preparatory briefing ended and pilots began final mission planning, Sarah's approach provided fresh ammunition for her critics. Her flight preparation required nearly an hour compared to the rapid mission updates that her competitors completed using automated systems that could recalculate routes and threat assessments in real time. Her manual plotting methods forced other pilots to wait, while she completed calculations that modern computers could perform in seconds. Stevens completed his mission planning in under 15 minutes, his advanced systems automatically incorporating weather updates, threat intelligence, and optimal routing calculations that would maximize his aircraft stealth advantages, while minimizing exposure to simulated enemy radar systems. His flight plan printed out on high-resolution displays that showed every detail of the planned engagement profile, including precise timing for weapons deployment and defensive maneuvering. Sarah's mission planning materials, by contrast, appeared scattered across her table in what looked like organized chaos to the casual observer. Her flight plan consisted of handwritten notes on charts that showed obvious signs of repeated use and modification. Her threat assessment was contained in a small notebook filled with observations that appeared to have been accumulated over years of operational experience rather than downloaded from current intelligence databases. 5 minutes per calculation, Johnson observed loudly during the planning period. At that rate, she'd still be figuring out her route while the rest of us are completing the mission and heading home for dinner. His assessment wasn't entirely unfair. Sarah's methodical approach to mission planning included consultation of references that seemed to involve reading atmospheric conditions like a farmer checking weather signs, analyzing terrain features using techniques that predated satellite navigation, and calculating fuel requirements based on methods that appeared to account for variables that computerized systems might overlook. The electronic mission planning systems confirmed what visual observation suggested. Sarah's projected performance placed her dead last among the exercise participants, with speed and altitude capabilities that would prevent her from keeping pace with the main formation. Her weapons range limitations meant she would be unable to engage targets until other aircraft had already completed their attacks, essentially relegating her to cleanup duties while real pilots handled the primary mission objectives. "This is embarrassing," Park said during the mid-morning break, addressing her concerns directly to Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. "We have someone's grandmother flying an aircraft that belongs in an aviation museum, and now she's supposedly going to participate in advanced air combat training. It's disrespectful to everyone who earned their place here through legitimate qualifications." Her frustration was shared by other pilots who viewed Sarah's poor planning performance as confirmation that proper screening procedures had been ignored. Brooks approached Harrison during the break to voice his concerns more directly. "Sir, with all due respect, having unqualified personnel in a complex air exercise creates safety issues and wastes training time that we can't afford to lose. This pilot is clearly operating equipment that isn't suitable for the mission profiles we're executing." His complaint carried the weight of extensive combat experience and multiple special operations deployments. Harrison found himself in an uncomfortable position, similar to the one he'd faced earlier. Sarah's paperwork remained impeccable, her authorization legitimate, and her conduct entirely appropriate despite her outdated methods. However, the growing chorus of complaints from his most experienced pilots created pressure to find a diplomatic solution that would preserve the integrity of the training program while avoiding the administrative nightmare that removing an authorized participant would create. The afternoon heat blazed mercilessly across Nellis as the exercise moved to the low-level penetration course, where margin for error shrank to feet rather than miles and terrain masking became as important as aircraft. Performance. The temperature had climbed to 108 degrees Fahrenheit, creating thermal conditions that challenged even the most sophisticated environmental control systems and played havoc with aircraft performance calculations that had been programmed for standard atmospheric conditions. This was the portion of red flag that separated elite pilots from merely competent ones, where equipment advantages mattered less than fundamental flying skills and the ability to think tactically while pulling multiple Gs in mountainous terrain. The electronic warfare environment would be active, creating conditions that simulated the most challenging threat scenarios American pilots might face in actual combat operations. Stevens had been building toward this moment all morning, his confidence growing with each successful briefing and planning session. His F-22 had performed flawlessly through the earlier phases, and his mission scores placed him comfortably at the top of the exercise rankings. The low-level course represented his specialty, high-speed navigation through complex terrain, where his aircraft's advanced systems and his years of training could provide decisive advantages over less experienced pilots flying inferior equipment. Sarah's continued presence in the exercise had become a source of increasing irritation for Stevens and his peers. Her planning scores remained consistently at the bottom of the rankings. Her outdated methods continued to draw amused comments from exercise controllers, and her methodical approach to every aspect of flight preparation had forced range officials to modify scheduling procedures to accommodate her leisurely pace. What had started as mild amusement was evolving into genuine resentment towards someone who seemed to be wasting everyone's time and resources. "I still don't understand how she even got authorization to participate," Stevens said during the equipment inspection period, his voice carrying clearly across the flight line where ground crews were conducting final checks on aircraft systems. "This is supposed to be advanced tactical training, not a senior citizen flying club reunion." His comment drew appreciative laughter from nearby pilots who shared his frustration with Sarah's dismal performance throughout the morning's activities. Johnson decided it was time to address the situation more directly. He approached Sarah's aircraft during the pre-flight inspection period, his bearing that of a senior pilot about to deliver corrective guidance to someone who clearly needed professional intervention. "Ma'am," he said, his tone professional but firm, "I've been observing your preparation methods today, and I'm concerned that you might be in over your head here." Sarah looked up from her A-10, where she was conducting what appeared to be a far more thorough pre-flight inspection than standard procedures required, examining components and systems that weren't part of normal checklists. Her inspection routine included checks that seemed to account for operational environments far more demanding than a Nevada training range. "Oh," she replied quietly, her expression neutral and attentive. "What specifically concerns you, Lieutenant?" Johnson gestured toward the mountainous terrain that stretched across the exercise area, where radar installations and simulated surface-to-air missile sites created electronic warfare conditions that challenged even the most advanced aircraft systems. "This course requires high-speed navigation through terrain where your aircraft's performance limitations become significant safety factors. The electronic warfare environment alone will challenge systems that were designed for these conditions. Frankly, I don't think that aircraft has the capability to operate safely in the threat environment we'll be facing." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his assessment with genuine interest rather than taking offense at his obvious skepticism. "You may be right," she said simply, patting the A-10's scarred fuselage with the kind of affection usually reserved for old friends. "This old bird has certainly seen better days." The gesture suggested someone acknowledging limitations rather than defending capabilities she knew her aircraft didn't possess. "Look," Johnson continued, warming to his theme and encouraged by her apparent recognition of the situation's realities. There's no shame in recognizing when you're outmatched. Modern air combat has evolved significantly since that aircraft was manufactured. The threat systems alone that we'll be facing today incorporate electronic warfare capabilities that older avionics simply weren't designed to handle. You're essentially bringing a propeller plane to a jet fighter exercise. Park had been listening to this exchange with growing satisfaction, feeling that Johnson was finally saying what she'd been thinking all morning. The older pilot's presence was becoming a distraction that detracted from the serious training the rest of them needed to accomplish, and someone needed to address the elephant in the room before safety became an issue. Lieutenant Johnson's. "Absolutely right, ma'am," Park interjected, stepping closer to join the conversation. "This isn't recreational flying or an airshow demonstration. The scenarios we'll be executing today simulate real combat conditions where technological inferiority translates directly to mission failure and potential casualties. Maybe there's a civilian aviation group or historical society that would be more appropriate for your aircraft and experience level." Sarah's response surprised both pilots. Instead of appearing offended or defensive about their assessment of her capabilities, she seemed genuinely curious about their perspective and willing to engage in professional discussion about the challenges they were describing. "You both make excellent points," she said, continuing her inspection routine while talking. "Modern threat environments certainly present challenges that weren't part of the original design parameters for this aircraft. The electronic warfare systems you'll be facing today represent decades of technological advancement since this bird was built." Her acknowledgement of their technological superiority seemed to embolden Johnson further. He gestured toward the F-22s being prepared nearby, their sleek forms bristling with antennas and sensors that represented the cutting edge of aerospace engineering. "Exactly. And it's not just the aircraft systems, it's the entire approach to air combat. Everything about modern fighter operations has advanced beyond what was possible with older platforms. The integration of sensor data, the networking capabilities between aircraft, the precision of weapon systems, all of it requires technology that simply didn't exist when your aircraft was designed." Stevens, having overheard the conversation from his adjacent parking spot, decided to join the discussion. His tone carried the confidence of someone who had never lost an air combat exercise that mattered, and the audience of ground crews and other pilots made this an opportunity to demonstrate his expertise. "The question is," he called out, approaching the group gathered around Sarah's aircraft, "what exactly do you think you're going to accomplish with that antique? You're already dead last in every performance category we've measured today. This afternoon's low-level course is where real flying begins, and that aircraft probably couldn't survive the first threat engagement, much less contribute anything meaningful to the overall mission." Sarah stood up slowly from her inspection position, her movements deliberate and unhurried despite the growing circle of pilots who had gathered to witness what appeared to be her inevitable acknowledgement that she was completely out of her depth. She looked across the flight line toward the mountainous terrain that would challenge every system and pilot participating in the afternoon exercise, where radar installations and electronic warfare emitters created conditions that tested both equipment and human performance to their absolute limits. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, her voice remaining conversational despite the obvious skepticism surrounding her, "you've all made excellent points about the limitations of older equipment and the advantages that modern systems provide in complex threat environments. Perhaps it would be more appropriate for me to acknowledge those limitations and request reassignment to a less demanding exercise before potentially compromising mission safety." She paused, as if weighing her options carefully while considering the advice these experienced pilots were offering. "But I wonder," she continued, something in her tone suggesting depths that none of the F-22 pilots had noticed during their morning interactions, "if you'd be willing to make this interesting. Since you're all so confident in your assessments of my capabilities and my aircraft's suitability for modern air combat, perhaps we could settle this with a simple demonstration. The suggestion hung in the desert air like a challenge that couldn't be ignored, carrying implications that went beyond simple training exercise protocols. Stevens straightened up, his competitive instincts immediately engaged by the possibility of a head-to-head comparison that would definitively prove what everyone already knew about technological superiority in modern air combat. "You want to go head-to-head?" Stevens asked, his voice betraying excitement at the prospect of demonstrating his superiority in front of an audience that included some of the most experienced pilots in the Air Force. Some kind of one-on-one engagement to determine who understands air combat and who's just pretending. The possibility of such a demonstration appealed to his sense of professional pride and his desire to settle the question of capability once and for all. "Something like that," Sarah replied, her tone remaining quiet and conversational. "Though I was thinking more along the lines of a practical exercise to determine whether assumptions about equipment and capability are always accurate predictors of performance outcomes." Her voice remained calm and pleasant, but there was something underneath it now that made several pilots lean forward to hear better, as if they were beginning to sense that this conversation was taking an unexpected direction. The challenge hung in the superheated Nevada air like a physical presence, drawing pilots and ground crews from across the flight line as word spread that someone was actually going to challenge Major Stevens and his advanced F-22 to a direct comparison. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered around the aircraft parking area, including several senior officers who had emerged from the air-conditioned comfort of the operations center to witness what promised to be either an impressive demonstration of tactical flying or a spectacular validation of everything they believed about modern air combat superiority. Sarah walked to her aircraft's external equipment storage compartment, retrieving items that had drawn criticism all morning, but now seemed to take on different significance in light of her unexpected challenge. The worn charts and handwritten notes that had appeared amateurish during briefings now suggested preparation methods that might conceal sophistication that wasn't immediately apparent to casual observers. Stevens couldn't suppress a grin as he watched Sarah's preparation ritual, confident that this demonstration would be easier than he'd anticipated, and that the audience would make his inevitable victory even more satisfying. He'd been flying F-22s competitively for over 6 years, had trained with some of the finest pilots in the world, and his aircraft represented the absolute pinnacle of air superiority technology. The idea that a pilot flying what amounted to a flying tank could challenge him in any aspect of air combat seemed not just unlikely, but almost insulting to everything he'd worked to achieve. "What are we flying for?" Stevens asked, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never lost an air combat engagement that mattered. "Just bragging rights, or did you have something more substantial in mind?" The question was directed as much to the gathered audience as to Sarah, establishing the stakes and ensuring that his victory would be witnessed by people whose opinions mattered in the Air Force aviation community. Sarah considered the question, while she retrieved her flight helmet from the cockpit, a piece of equipment that showed the same wear and modification that characterized everything else in her possession. The helmet's surface was scarred and marked with symbols that weren't part of standard Air Force inventory, suggesting operational experience in environments that weren't acknowledged in public records. "I was thinking more along the lines of professional respect," she said quietly, her words carrying across the assembled crowd with surprising clarity. "A demonstration that capability isn't always determined by the age of equipment or the assumptions people make based on appearances." The simplicity of her stated objective somehow made the challenge seem more significant than any monetary stakes or formal competition could have achieved. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison found himself in an impossible position that tested every protocol and regulation governing training exercises at Nellis. allowing an unauthorized air combat demonstration, violated multiple safety procedures and training regulations. But the situation had evolved beyond his ability to control diplomatically. The crowd of pilots surrounding the aircraft included several flag officers whose presence made any attempt to shut down the proceedings politically complicated and potentially career-damaging. Single engagement, Harrison announced, deciding to formalize the demonstration rather than try to prevent something that had already gained momentum beyond his control. Low-level navigation through the mountain course, with electronic warfare systems active and threat emitters simulating surface-to-air missile sites. Standard red flag scoring procedures apply, with range safety officers monitoring all aspects of the engagement. His tone suggested resignation rather than enthusiasm, but the assembled pilots responded with the kind of energy that accompanied any direct competition between their peers. Sarah nodded her acceptance of the terms while she consulted her handwritten charts one final time, making quick calculations using methods that predated the computerized systems her competitor relied upon for mission planning. The wind conditions had shifted slightly since her last observation, and she made adjustments to her flight plan using pencil annotations that appeared to follow procedures learned long ago and refined through countless repetitions in conditions far more challenging than a Nevada training range. The terrain ahead stretched across 50 miles of mountainous desert that had been transformed into one of the most sophisticated electronic warfare environments in the world. Radar installations, missile simulation systems, and communication. Jamming equipment created conditions that replicated the most challenging threat scenarios American pilots might encounter in actual combat operations. Successfully navigating this course required not just flying skill, but tactical thinking, electronic warfare knowledge, and the ability to make split-second decisions while traveling at speeds that compressed reaction time to milliseconds. Stevens took his position in the F-22's cockpit with movements that demonstrated years of competitive flying experience and hundreds of hours in high-performance aircraft. His pre-flight procedures were executed with mechanical precision, each switch activation and system check performed according to protocols that had been refined through extensive testing and operational experience. The aircraft startup sequence alone represented technological sophistication that previous generations of fighters couldn't approach. His helmet-mounted display came online with information that would have overwhelmed pilots from earlier eras, providing real-time threat analysis, navigation guidance, and weapon system status in formats that integrated seamlessly with his aircraft's other sensors. The F-22's radar system could track multiple targets simultaneously while maintaining the stealth profile that made it nearly invisible to conventional detection methods. Sarah's preparation routine was considerably simpler, but somehow more deliberate, suggesting someone who had learned to accomplish complex tasks without relying on automated systems that might fail when needed most. Her startup procedures included checks that weren't part of standard protocols, examining backup systems and redundant equipment that suggested operational experience in environments where mechanical failure could be fatal. The A-10's cockpit represented a different philosophy of aircraft design, emphasizing reliability and survivability over technological sophistication. The titanium armor surrounding Sarah provided protection against threats that could destroy more lightly built aircraft, while her aircraft's twin engines were positioned to continue functioning even after sustaining damage that would cripple single-engine fighters. As both aircraft taxied toward the runway for the demonstration that would settle questions about capability and technological superiority, the assembled crowd of pilots and support personnel represented every level of Air Force aviation experience. This wasn't just a contest between two aircraft or two pilots. It had become a validation of fundamental beliefs about modern air combat, technological advancement, and the factors that determine success in environments where mistakes could be measured in lives rather than training scores. The takeoff sequence began with Stevens' F-22 Raptor accelerating down Nellis runway with the kind of raw power that made the ground shake beneath the feet of everyone watching from the observation areas. The twin Pratt & Whitney engines generated over 70,000 pounds of thrust, propelling the sleek fighter from standstill to rotation speed in seconds that seemed to compress time itself. The aircraft lifted off the runway with the grace of a predator designed for three-dimensional combat, its thrust vectoring nozzles automatically adjusting to optimize climb performance as it disappeared into the brilliant Nevada sky. Sarah's A-10 followed with a takeoff that emphasized different priorities entirely. The twin General Electric engines spooled up with a sound that spoke of reliability rather than raw performance, generating enough thrust to lift the heavily armored aircraft but without the spectacular display that characterized modern fighters. Her rotation was deliberate and controlled, suggesting someone who understood that, in her line of work, returning safely was more important than impressing observers with dramatic departures. The contrast between the two aircraft became even more apparent once they were airborne and began forming up for the navigation exercise that would determine whose approach to air combat was superior. Stevens' F-22 climbed effortlessly to 25,000 feet, where its stealth characteristics and advanced radar systems could provide maximum advantage over any conventional aircraft operating in the same airspace. His cockpit displays showed a comprehensive picture of the electronic warfare environment ahead, with threat locations, radar coverage patterns, and optimal routing calculated automatically by computers that processed information faster than human minds could follow. Sarah's A-10 remained at low altitude, hugging the desert floor with the kind of terrain-following flight profile that characterized aircraft designed for close air support missions rather than air superiority operations. Her navigation relied on visual references and dead reckoning techniques that predated satellite guidance systems, using landmarks and terrain features that appeared in her handwritten charts but weren't part of computerized databases. The electronic warfare environment activated as both aircraft entered the mountain course, creating conditions that replicated the most challenging scenarios American pilots might face against peer adversaries equipped with modern air defense systems. Radar installations began tracking both aircraft while surface-to-air missile simulation systems locked onto their signatures, creating audio and visual warnings that tested pilot reaction times and tactical decision-making under stress. Stevens' response to the electronic threats demonstrated exactly why the F-22 had been designed with stealth capabilities as its primary advantage. His aircraft's radar cross-section remained minimal even under direct observation from multiple threat emitters, while his electronic warfare suite automatically deployed countermeasures that confused simulated missile systems and broke radar locks before they could achieve firing solutions. His progress through the course was smooth and efficient, following routing that maximized his aircraft's technological advantages while minimizing exposure to defensive systems. The threat picture displayed in Stevens' cockpit showed Sarah's A-10 as a large, slow-moving target that was immediately detected by every radar system in the exercise area. Her aircraft's conventional design provided no stealth characteristics, making her visible to defensive systems that couldn't even detect his F-22's presence. The electronic warfare display suggested that any real surface-to-air missile system would have engaged and destroyed her aircraft within minutes of entering the threat environment. Sarah's approach to the same electronic warfare challenges demonstrated a completely different philosophy that confused the range safety officers monitoring both aircraft. Instead of trying to avoid radar detection, she seemed to be deliberately exposing herself to every threat system in the area, while maneuvering through terrain that should have made her an easy target for any competent missile operator. Her flight path took her through valleys and canyons that channeled her directly toward the most dangerous defensive positions. What the monitoring systems couldn't initially explain was why none of the simulated missile sites were achieving successful engagements against Sarah's aircraft, despite her apparent vulnerability and obvious exposure to their radar coverage. Her flight profile kept her below minimum engagement altitudes for most surface-to-air systems, while her routing through mountainous terrain created masking effects that broke targeting solutions, just as missiles would have reached firing parameters. The navigation portion of the exercise revealed tactical knowledge that went beyond what any computer system had been programmed to recognize. Sarah's route planning had anticipated every threat location and calculated approach angles that exploited blind spots in radar coverage that weren't apparent from studying electronic maps or database information. Her timing through each valley and canyon segment was precise enough to avoid overlapping fields of fire from adjacent defensive positions. Stevens found himself watching his displays with growing confusion as Sarah's aircraft continued to progress through the course without triggering any of the automatic engagement sequences that should have destroyed conventional aircraft attempting such obvious approaches to defended targets. His own route was technically perfect, utilizing every advantage his F-22 systems could provide. But Sarah's seemingly suicidal tactics were somehow proving equally effective at avoiding defensive fires. The first mountain pass required navigation through terrain that rose to over 8,000 feet above sea level, creating atmospheric conditions that challenged aircraft performance and pilot decision-making simultaneously. Stevens' F-22 handled the altitude changes effortlessly, its environmental control systems maintaining cockpit conditions while his engines provided power that remained consistent regardless of atmospheric density variations. Sarah's A-10 struggled more noticeably with the altitude changes, her engines working harder to maintain airspeed as atmospheric pressure decreased and oxygen content dropped. But her flight path through the mountains demonstrated intimate knowledge of terrain features that couldn't be learned from studying charts or satellite imagery. She used updrafts and thermal currents to supplement engine power, while her routing avoided downdrafts and wind shear areas that could have created dangerous flight conditions. The electronic jamming environment intensified as both aircraft approached the halfway point of the navigation course, where multiple threat emitters created overlapping fields of electromagnetic interference designed to disrupt communication systems, navigation equipment, and weapon targeting computers. This was the portion of the exercise where technological sophistication was supposed to provide decisive advantages to aircraft equipped with modern defensive systems. Stevens' F-22 handled the jamming environment exactly as its designers had intended, with electronic warfare suites that automatically identified threat frequencies and deployed appropriate countermeasures without requiring pilot intervention. His communication systems remained clear. His navigation displays continued to provide accurate positioning information, and his weapon systems maintained full capability despite the intense electromagnetic environment surrounding his aircraft. Sarah's A-10 should have been severely degraded by the same electronic warfare conditions that her opponent's systems were designed to overcome. Her communications equipment was based on technology that predated most modern jamming techniques, while her navigation systems relied on components that should have been completely overwhelmed by the interference levels being generated throughout the exercise area. Yet somehow her aircraft continued to function normally despite operating in an electronic environment that should have rendered its systems useless. Her communication transmissions remained clear and professional. Her navigation appeared unaffected by jamming that was disrupting even some of the range safety monitoring equipment, and her tactical awareness seemed undiminished by electromagnetic interference that was designed to overwhelm older aircraft systems. The mystery deepened when range controllers noticed that Sarah's aircraft was not only surviving the electronic warfare environment, but seemed to be using the jamming signals themselves for navigation purposes. Her flight path corrections corresponded precisely with changes in electromagnetic interference patterns, suggesting that she was somehow using the threat emitters as navigation beacons rather than obstacles to be avoided or overcome. Stevens completed the navigation course in excellent time. His F-22's superior speed and altitude capabilities, allowing him to cover the required distance efficiently, while avoiding most of the terrain and electronic warfare challenges that complicated routing for conventional aircraft. His mission score reflected precisely the kind of performance that Air Force training programs were designed to produce from pilots flying the most advanced fighters in the American inventory. His tactical approach had been textbook perfect, utilizing every advantage that modern technology could provide while minimizing risks that might compromise mission success. The electronic warfare environment that had been designed to challenge even advanced aircraft had been handled smoothly by systems that represented decades of research and development investment. His overall performance validated every assumption about technological superiority in modern air combat scenarios. Sarah's completion of the same course provided results that challenged fundamental assumptions about aircraft capability and pilot performance under adverse conditions. Her time was actually faster than Stevens despite flying an aircraft with significantly lower maximum speed, suggesting that her routing choices and tactical decisions had provided advantages that raw performance specifications couldn't explain. More troubling for the observers monitoring the exercise was the fact that Sarah's aircraft had not only survived conditions designed to overwhelm older systems, but had somehow thrived in an environment where technological inferiority should have guaranteed mission failure. Her electronic warfare performance suggested capabilities that weren't apparent from studying her aircraft specification sheets or observing her equipment during pre-flight inspections. The scoring systems that evaluated both aircraft provided data that contradicted expectations in ways that forced range officials to review their monitoring procedures and verify that their equipment was functioning correctly. By every measure that should have mattered, Stevens' F-22 possessed overwhelming advantages in speed, altitude capability, stealth characteristics, and electronic warfare resistance. Yet the objective results showed performance levels that suggested those advantages had been neutralized by factors that weren't part of standard evaluation criteria. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison found himself studying readouts that didn't match any pattern he'd seen during years of managing red flag exercises. The data indicated that both aircraft had completed the navigation course successfully, but Sarah's performance metrics suggested capabilities that shouldn't have been possible given her equipment limitations and the challenging conditions she'd faced throughout the exercise. The mountain course concluded with both aircraft returning to base airspace, where their approaches to landing provided one final opportunity to observe the differences in their operational philosophies. Stevens' F-22 executed a precision approach that demonstrated the kind of automated flight control capabilities that represented the cutting edge of aerospace engineering, with systems that could compensate for wind conditions, atmospheric variations, and pilot input errors automatically. Sarah's approach was entirely manual, relying on pilot skill and experience rather than automated systems to manage the complex atmospheric conditions that characterized evening operations at Nellis. Her landing was smooth and controlled, suggesting someone who had learned to fly in environments where electronic aids might not be available in pilot judgment was the primary factor determining safe operations. The debriefing session that followed their return to base was unlike anything the assembled pilots had experienced during previous red flag exercises. The performance data contradicted assumptions about technological superiority that formed the foundation of modern Air Force training doctrine, while Sarah's tactical decisions demonstrated knowledge that wasn't part of standard pilot education programs. Stevens found himself confronting results that challenged everything he believed about air combat superiority and the factors that determined mission success in contested environments. His F-22 had performed exactly as designed, utilizing every technological advantage available to modern fighters. Yet somehow Sarah's antique aircraft had achieved results that seemed to mock the very concept of equipment-based superiority. The electronic warfare data was particularly confusing to analysts who specialized in understanding how different aircraft systems responded to jamming and interference. Sarah's A-10 had not only survived conditions designed to overwhelm older equipment but had demonstrated electronic warfare resistance that exceeded the performance of some modern fighters, specifically designed for such environments. Park found herself reviewing flight data that forced her to reconsider fundamental assumptions about aircraft capability and pilot performance that had guided her entire military career. The woman she'd dismissed as hopelessly outclassed had somehow achieved results that challenged the very foundations of modern fighter training and tactical doctrine. Johnson's expertise in identifying pilot weaknesses and equipment limitations had proven completely inadequate for understanding Sarah's performance throughout the navigation exercise. His analysis methods, which had been successful for evaluating conventional pilots flying standard aircraft, seemed irrelevant when applied to someone whose capabilities extended beyond normal evaluation parameters. The gathered pilots found themselves confronting evidence that technological superiority didn't guarantee tactical advantage in all circumstances, and that assumptions about equipment limitations might not account for factors that could compensate for apparent disadvantages. Sarah's performance had demonstrated that experience, tactical knowledge, and operational understanding could overcome technological disparities that should have been insurmountable. Brooks, whose special operations background included experience with unconventional tactics and equipment limitations, was among the first to recognize that Sarah's capabilities represented something beyond standard pilot training and normal aircraft performance. Her approach to electronic warfare and terrain navigation suggested operational experience in environments where technological solutions weren't available or reliable. The range safety officers responsible for monitoring exercise safety and scoring found themselves reviewing procedures that hadn't anticipated performance levels like those Sarah had demonstrated. Her tactics had exploited aspects of the electronic warfare environment that weren't part of standard training scenarios, while her navigation methods had utilized terrain features in ways that suggested knowledge that couldn't be acquired through classroom instruction or simulator training. Harrison's attempts to understand how Sarah had achieved such results led to communications with higher authorities who possessed security clearances that extended beyond his normal access levels. The conversations that followed provided information that began to explain Sarah's background and the sources of capabilities that had confounded some of the Air Force's most experienced pilots and sophisticated monitoring systems. The evening briefing that traditionally concluded each day's red flag activities was dominated by discussions of performance data that challenged conventional wisdom about air combat effectiveness and the factors that determine success in complex operational environments. Sarah's results had forced a fundamental reconsideration of assumptions that guided training programs, equipment acquisition decisions, and tactical doctrine development. The implications of what had occurred during the afternoon's exercise extended far beyond the immediate training environment. If a pilot flying outdated equipment could achieve results that matched or exceeded the performance of the most advanced fighters in American inventory, then fundamental questions needed to be asked about military aviation priorities and the relationship between technological sophistication and operational effectiveness. Stevens found himself facing the crisis of professional confidence that threatened to undermine everything he believed about his own capabilities and the superiority of the equipment he'd spent years mastering. The woman he'd mocked for her antiquated aircraft had demonstrated abilities that made his advanced training and expensive equipment seem somehow inadequate for challenges that extended beyond traditional air-to-air combat scenarios. The F-22 pilots who had gathered to witness Sarah's expected humiliation found themselves instead confronting evidence that their understanding of air combat was incomplete and that their assumptions about technological advantage might be based Unlimited perspectives about what constituted effective military aviation in real operational environments. The secure communication that arrived at Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's office 30 minutes after the exercise. Conclusion changed everything about the situation at Nellis Air Force Base. The call came through encrypted channels that Harrison rarely accessed during routine training operations. From General Patricia Morrison, whose authority extended across multiple commands and whose involvement in red flag exercises was unprecedented in Harrison's experience managing the program. General Morrison's briefing provided information that transformed Sarah Mitchell from an embarrassing anomaly into something far more significant and politically sensitive. The pilot who had been dismissed by F-22 aviators as hopelessly outclassed was revealed to be Colonel Sarah Mitchell, though her actual rank had been deliberately obscured in exercise documentation, for reasons that became clear as Morrison continued. Her explanation: Sarah's service record included operations that officially never happened, conducted in locations that didn't appear on any map accessible through normal intelligence channels. Her background encompassed close air support missions in environments where electronic warfare conditions exceeded anything that Red Flag could simulate, using tactics that had been developed through years of operational experience in conflicts that remained classified at levels requiring presidential authorization to acknowledge. The A-10 Thunderbolt that had drawn so much ridicule throughout the day wasn't just another aircraft from the Air Force inventory. It was Sarah's personal mount, modified through programs that existed in budget categories requiring congressional oversight and equipped with capabilities that weren't reflected in standard technical specifications. The battle damage and wear that had made it appear antiquated actually represented combat experience in theaters where aircraft survival depended on modifications that couldn't be purchased through normal procurement channels. Stevens found himself facing the complete demolition of his professional confidence and his understanding of military aviation hierarchy. The woman he'd mocked for her outdated equipment had just been revealed as someone whose operational achievements made his own accomplishments seem like training exercises. His F-22, his advanced training, his combat decorations, all of it suddenly felt inadequate compared to capabilities that existed in realms he hadn't known were possible. Harrison's return to the pilot briefing area carried information that would permanently alter careers and reputations throughout the Red Flag community. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of official authority that came from communications with flag officers whose decisions shaped Air Force policy. "I need to inform you that Colonel Sarah Mitchell is a recipient of the Air Force Cross, the Silver Star with Oak Leaf Cluster, and the Distinguished Flying Cross with multiple awards for valor in combat operations that remain classified." The silence that followed this announcement was absolute and uncomfortable. Pilots who had been joking about Sarah's appearance and equipment minutes earlier found themselves confronting the reality that they had been insulting a living legend, whose achievements existed at the very pinnacle of military aviation. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful as they tried to reconcile their morning's behavior with information that revealed they had been criticizing someone whose service record included decorations that most pilots could only dream of earning. Colonel Mitchell holds the record for most successful close air support missions in Air Force history. Harrison continued, reading from notes he'd taken during his conversation with General Morrison. Her tactics and techniques have been incorporated into training programs throughout multiple commands, and her operational innovations have saved thousands of lives in conflicts where CONVENT, IONAL air power proved inadequate for mission requirements. Park felt her stomach drop as she realized the full extent of her morning's behavior and comments. She had questioned the qualifications of someone whose service record included achievements that made her own career seem elementary by comparison. Her statements about Sarah's suitability for advanced training now seemed not just inappropriate, but professionally catastrophic, particularly if word of her disrespectful treatment reached the command levels that had authorized Colonel Mitchell's participation in Red Flag, Johnson found himself facing a crisis of professional judgment that threatened to undermine everything he'd believed about his ability to assess pilot capability and aircraft effectiveness. His expertise in identifying weaknesses and limitations had led him to completely misread someone whose actual qualifications placed her beyond anything he could aspire to reach. The woman he'd suggested should withdraw from the exercise had achievement levels that made his own special operations background seem routine. The electronic scoring data that had shown Sarah's superior performance throughout the navigation exercise suddenly required complete recontextualization. Harrison's additional information revealed that Colonel Mitchell had been deliberately operating her aircraft below its actual capabilities, using equipment and techniques that showcased only a fraction of what her modified A-10 could accomplish. When operated by someone with her level of expertise and operational experience, the perfect navigation performance hadn't been lucky or coincidental. It had been a controlled demonstration of abilities that had been proven effective in combat environments where the margin for error was measured in lives rather than training scores. Her electronic warfare resistance hadn't resulted from superior equipment, but from techniques that had been developed through operational necessity in conflicts where technological solutions weren't available or reliable. Brooks, whose special operations background provided context that other pilots lacked, was among the first to understand the implications of what they'd witnessed. Colonel Mitchell's capabilities represented operational experience at classification, levels that existed beyond normal military acknowledgement. Her tactics had been proven effective against adversaries whose capabilities exceeded anything that Red Flag could simulate, in environments where mission failure had consequences that extended far beyond training evaluations. Sarah's response to the revelation of her background was characteristically understated, continuing to organize her equipment with the same methodical precision she displayed throughout the day. She showed neither satisfaction from the recognition nor irritation at having her cover compromised by higher command intervention. Her demeanor suggested someone accustomed to having her capabilities misunderstood and her appearance used as justification for dismissive treatment. The records Lieutenant Colonel Harrison mentioned represent team achievements, Sarah said quietly, addressing the assembled pilots whose attitudes had transformed completely during the previous few minutes. Individual success in close air support operations is usually the result of exceptional cooperation from ground controllers, intelligence personnel, and support teams whose contributions don't appear in official documentation or public recognition ceremonies. Her attempt to deflect personal credit only enhanced the respect that was beginning to replace the morning's mockery among pilots, who were finally understanding the magnitude of their misjudgment. Stevens approached Colonel Mitchell with the expression of someone seeking forgiveness for behavior that now seemed unforgivably ignorant and disrespectful to someone whose service had earned recognition at the highest levels of military command. "Ma'am," Stevens said, his voice carrying genuine remorse mixed with professional embarrassment that would probably follow him throughout his career, "I owe you a sincere apology. My comments throughout the day were completely inappropriate, and I had no right to question your presence here or your aircraft's capabilities. Your performance today demonstrated abilities that I didn't understand and achievements that I should have recognized." Sarah's response demonstrated the kind of grace that distinguished truly exceptional military professionals from merely skilled aviators. "No apology necessary, Major. Your assessment was based on available information and reasonable assumptions about aircraft performance and pilot capabilities. Most people evaluating equipment like mine wouldn't expect the kind of performance you witnessed today. Your skepticism was entirely justified given the information you had access to." The pilots surrounding Colonel Mitchell found themselves witnessing a masterclass in professional humility delivered by someone whose achievements gave her every right to be condescending toward people who had spent the morning treating her with barely concealed contempt. Instead, she was offering understanding and forgiveness to aviators who had demonstrated behavior that reflected poorly on their judgment and military professionalism. Park approached with expressions of remorse that reflected her understanding of how seriously she had misjudged both Colonel Mitchell's capabilities and the appropriate way to treat a fellow military professional. "Ma'am, I want to apologize for my behavior and comments throughout the day. As a female pilot, I should have understood better than anyone the importance of not making assumptions about capability based on appearances or first impressions." "Captain Park," Sarah replied, "your concern for maintaining high standards in military aviation is exactly what the Air Force needs from its pilots. Your questions about qualifications and equipment suitability demonstrated professional responsibility rather than personal prejudice. Those are valuable instincts that will serve you well throughout your career." Johnson found himself seeking guidance from someone whose tactical knowledge had proven far superior to his own analytical abilities. "Colonel, if I may ask, those electronic warfare techniques you demonstrated today, they're not part of standard Air Force training curricula. Where did you learn to use jamming signals for navigation purposes? And how did you anticipate threat location patterns that our computers hadn't identified?" Sarah's answer provided insights that would influence Air Force training doctrine for years to come. Experience in environments where electronic aid navigation wasn't available or reliable taught adaptation techniques that aren't part of peacetime training programs. When you operate in contested airspace where GPS signals are jammed, communication systems are compromised, and threat locations change constantly, you learn to use whatever information sources remain functional. The implications of her statement began to sink in among pilots who understood that Sarah was describing operational conditions that exceeded anything they'd trained for during their careers. Her techniques had been developed through necessity, rather than classroom instruction, proven effective against adversaries whose capabilities represented threats that American pilots might face in future conflicts. General Morrison's arrival at Nellis 2 hours later confirmed that Colonel Mitchell's presence represented something far more significant than routine training participation. The general's personal attention to what should have been a routine red flag exercise indicated command, interest at levels that didn't typically involve themselves in individual pilot performance or training outcomes. "Colonel Mitchell," General Morrison said formally upon arriving at the squadron area where pilots were still processing the day's revelations, "I want to apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced during your time here. Your contributions to Air Force tactical development and training innovation deserve recognition and respect rather than the treatment you received from personnel who weren't properly briefed on your background and qualifications." Morrison's statement carried implications about Sarah's role in developing the very training programs and tactical procedures that the F-22 pilots had been using to measure their own capabilities against her performance. Colonel Mitchell's influence extended beyond individual achievement to encompass systematic improvements in Air Force operational effectiveness. Sarah's acknowledgement of General Morrison's intervention was gracious but brief, suggesting someone more interested in continuing her work than dwelling on recognition or past difficulties. "Thank you, General. The training I've observed today demonstrates significant advances in pilot preparation and tactical integration. The aircrew here represent the finest traditions of Air Force aviation excellence." The transformation at Nellis Air Force Base was immediate and comprehensive. Within hours of General Morrison's revelation about Colonel Mitchell's background, word had spread throughout the base about the legendary close air support pilot who had been hiding in plain sight among routine red flag participants. Personnel who had dismissed her that morning now approached with the kind of reverence usually reserved for Medal of Honor recipients or commanders whose tactical brilliance had saved entire operations from disaster. Colonel Mitchell found herself invited to address the advanced tactics course that evening, where she shared insights that revolutionized how Air Force pilots understood close air support operations in contested environments. Her presentation focused not on equipment advantages or technological solutions, but on fundamental skills that transcended hardware limitations and remained effective when electronic systems failed or were compromised by enemy action. She demonstrated threat assessment techniques that relied on environmental observation rather than electronic intelligence gathering, navigation methods that remained functional when satellite systems were jammed or destroyed, and communication procedures that had been proven effective when conventional radio networks were compromised. Her teaching methods emphasized adaptability and resourcefulness over technological dependence. Stevens underwent a personal transformation that extended far beyond professional embarrassment about his morning's behavior. Colonel Mitchell's gracious response to his disrespectful treatment forced him to confront assumptions about capability and military hierarchy that had guided his career development. He requested permission to observe her training methods, seeking to understand how someone could achieve such extraordinary results with equipment that conventional wisdom considered obsolete. Sarah's willingness to share her knowledge with pilots who had treated her poorly demonstrated a level of professionalism that became legendary within red flag culture. She spent 3 days working individually with aviators who struggled with navigation and tactical decision-making under adverse conditions, teaching techniques that had been developed through decades of operational application rather than theoretical study. Her methods produced immediate improvements in pilot performance that validated approaches many instructors had considered outdated or impractical for modern air combat environments. Pilots learned to read atmospheric conditions without relying on electronic instruments, navigate using terrain features when GPS systems failed, and maintain situational awareness when communication networks were compromised by enemy action. Park found that Colonel Mitchell's example transformed her own approach to leadership and pilot development. Watching someone respond to disrespect with patience and professional mentorship rather than anger or retaliation provided a model for handling the challenges that female pilots faced in environments where their capabilities were constantly questioned. Colonel Mitchell's demonstration that true strength often came disguised as vulnerability became a guiding principle that Park carried forward throughout her military career. She learned that competence didn't require constant validation through aggressive behavior or technological superiority, but could be demonstrated through quiet professionalism and consistent performance under adverse conditions. The A-10 Thunderbolt that had drawn so much ridicule was eventually assigned permanent display status at the Air Force Museum, accompanied by documentation of Colonel Mitchell's service record and the operational achievements that aircraft had made possible. The exhibit became required viewing for all pilots attending advanced tactical training, serving as a permanent reminder that capability couldn't be judged by appearance and that technological advantages meant nothing without fundamental airmanship. Skills. Johnson's assessment abilities, which had failed so spectacularly in Colonel Mitchell's case, were recalibrated through extensive discussion with her about the subtleties of identifying true competence beyond surface appearances. Her insights about recognizing pilot potential, regardless of equipment or presentation style, became incorporated into instructor training programs throughout the Air Force. Thompson's experience became a case study in the dangers of assumption-based evaluation that was taught at military leadership schools across multiple services. The lessons learned from Colonel Mitchell's visit influenced how military professionals approach the evaluation of personnel and equipment, whose capabilities might not be immediately apparent through conventional assessment methods. Colonel Mitchell's influence extended far beyond individual training interactions. The techniques she shared were documented and integrated into official Air Force doctrine, improving the effectiveness of close air support training programs across all installations. Her emphasis on adaptability and equipment-independent skills proved particularly valuable for operations in austere environments where technological solutions might not be available or reliable. The story of Colonel Mitchell's visit to Nellis became part of Air Force folklore, told and retold in training environments as an example of the importance of recognizing excellence regardless of how it was packaged. New pilots learned about the danger of judging capability by appearance and the value of maintaining open minds when evaluating others' potential contributions to mission success. Years later, several of the pilots who had witnessed Colonel Mitchell's demonstration credited that experience with transforming their own leadership styles and evaluation methods. Stevens became known for his ability to identify overlooked talent among junior pilots, while Park developed mentorship programs that helped other women navigate the challenges of proving themselves in competitive military environments. Johnson's tactical analysis methods were enhanced by understanding that true capability often remained hidden until circumstances demanded its revelation. Brooks used his special operations experience to develop training programs that emphasized resourcefulness and adaptability over technological dependence. Colonel Mitchell returned to her classified assignments, her brief appearance at Nellis having accomplished something more valuable than any official recognition could provide. She had reminded an entire generation of Air Force pilots that true excellence often came in unexpected packages, that respect should be earned through demonstrated capability rather than assumed based on appearances, and that the most dangerous opponents were often those who appeared least threatening. The ancient A-10 had delivered more than superior navigation performance that day. It had delivered a lesson about humility, respect, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize the depth of capability that might be hidden beneath unassuming exteriors. The pilots who learned that lesson carried it forward, creating a culture that valued substance over style and competence over assumptions. 3 years after that legendary day at Nellis, Colonel Sarah Mitchell received an invitation that brought everything full circle. The Air Force had established the Mitchell Excellence in Tactical Innovation Award, recognizing pilots who demonstrated exceptional skill with unconventional methods or overcame significant equipment disadvantages through pure talent and operational understanding. Colonel Mitchell stood before an audience of 800 Air Force personnel at the inaugural ceremony, her battle-worn A-10 displayed in a place of honor beside the most advanced fighters in the American inventory. The same pilots who had once mocked her outdated equipment now studied it with reverence, understanding that true tactical excellence transcended technological advantages. This aircraft taught me something that all the computers and advanced systems in the world can't replace, Colonel Mitchell told the assembled crowd, her voice carrying across the silent auditorium. It taught me that excellence isn't about having the newest equipment or the most sophisticated technology. It's about making the most of what you have and never allowing assumptions to define your limitations or potential contributions. Stevens, now an instructor himself, presented the first award to a young lieutenant who had achieved remarkable tactical success, despite flying an aircraft with compromised systems. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The pilot who had once dismissed Colonel Mitchell, based on her appearance, was now celebrating exactly the kind of determination and adaptability she had demonstrated. Colonel Mitchell's legacy lived on, not just in Air Force doctrine, but in a fundamental shift in how military professionals evaluated capability and potential. Her single perfect demonstration had shattered more than just assumptions about aircraft performance. It had destroyed the dangerous preconceptions that could blind even the most experienced professionals to excellence hiding in plain sight. The ancient A-10 remained in its display case, a permanent reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't the newest or most expensive. They're the ones wielded by people who understand that true strength comes from within, and that capability isn't determined by appearances, but by the depth of knowledge, experience, and determination that lies beneath the surface. The legacy of that transformative day at Nellis rippled through the Air Force in ways that nobody could have anticipated. fundamentally altering how military aviation approached the relationship between technology and human capability. 5 years after Colonel Sarah Mitchell's demonstration, the effects of her brief appearance at Red Flag had reshaped training doctrine, influenced aircraft procurement decisions, and changed the way an entire generation of pilots understood the nature of tactical excellence. At Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, Major Stevens found himself standing before a classroom filled with young pilots whose eager faces reminded him of his own overconfidence from years earlier. As the lead instructor for the Advanced Tactical Employment course, he had developed a reputation for identifying the subtle signs of arrogance that could prove fatal in combat situations. His teaching methods emphasized humility and adaptability over technological reliance, concepts that would have seemed foreign to the Stevens who had mocked Colonel Mitchell's ancient aircraft. The lesson plan displayed on his classroom screen featured detailed analysis of historical air combat engagements where inferior equipment had triumphed over superior technology through tactical innovation and pilot skill. These case studies had become central to Air Force pilot education, replacing previous curricula that had focused primarily on exploiting technological advantages over potential adversaries. Stevens had personally developed many of these training scenarios based on insights he'd gained through years of studying Colonel Mitchell's techniques and operational philosophy. The most dangerous assumption you can make as a fighter pilot, Stevens told his students during a lecture that had become legendary throughout the Air Force training community, is that your equipment will compensate for tactical deficiencies or poor decision-making. Technology provides tools, but victory depends on understanding how to employ those tools effectively under conditions that may not match your training scenarios. His transformation from arrogant technology advocate to thoughtful tactical instructor hadn't occurred overnight. The process had required years of studying combat reports, analyzing engagement data, and gradually understanding that Colonel Mitchell's success hadn't been accidental or lucky. Her methods represented systematic approaches to air combat that had been refined through operational experience in environments where survival depended on adapting to circumstances that couldn't be controlled or predicted. Stevens students learned about situational awareness techniques that didn't require electronic sensors, navigation methods that remained functional when satellite systems were compromised, and communication procedures that could maintain unit coordination even when advanced networks failed. These skills had once been considered obsolete, but combat experience in contested environments had proven their continued relevance for modern military operations. At Ramstein Air Base in Germany, Colonel Park commanded the 86th Operations Group, where her leadership style reflected lessons learned from observing Colonel Mitchell's gracious response to disrespectful treatment. Her approach to personnel management emphasized recognizing potential that might not be immediately apparent, developing capabilities that transcended technological dependence, and creating environments where unconventional thinking was valued rather than discouraged. Park's unit had achieved recognition throughout United States Air Forces in Europe for innovation in close air support operations, particularly in scenarios where electronic warfare conditions limited the effectiveness of advanced systems. Her pilots trained extensively in techniques that Colonel Mitchell had demonstrated during that memorable Red Flag exercise, learning to operate effectively when the technological advantages they'd been taught to rely upon were neutralized by adversary capabilities. The 86th Operations Group had become a testing ground for tactical concepts that challenged conventional wisdom about air power employment. Park's pilots regularly practiced missions using deliberately degraded communication systems, compromised navigation equipment, and limited electronic warfare protection. These training scenarios prepared them for operational environments where technological superiority couldn't be assumed and tactical flexibility became the determining factor in mission success. Park's mentorship programs for female pilots had gained international recognition, providing models for other military services struggling to integrate women into combat roles effectively. Her methods emphasized competence demonstration through performance rather than confrontation, showing that professional excellence could overcome prejudice more effectively than aggressive advocacy or demands for special consideration. The women who trained under Park's guidance learned to let their capabilities speak for themselves while maintaining the kind of professional grace that Colonel Mitchell had displayed under difficult circumstances. They understood that earning respect required consistent demonstration of skills and judgment that couldn't be questioned, regardless of others' preconceptions about female capabilities in combat aviation. At the Pentagon, Lieutenant General Johnson had risen to become Director of Air Force Requirements, where his experiences with Colonel Mitchell had profoundly influenced his approach to aircraft acquisition and capability development. His office had become known for challenging assumptions about the relationship between cost and effectiveness, questioning whether the most expensive solutions necessarily provided the best operational outcomes. Johnson's leadership had resulted in renewed investment in pilot training programs that emphasized fundamental airmanship skills over technological dependence. He had advocated successfully for training scenarios that deliberately challenged pilots to operate effectively when advanced systems failed or were compromised, ensuring that American aviators could maintain tactical effectiveness under adverse conditions. The acquisition strategies Johnson championed reflected understanding that operational success required balanced approaches to capability development. While he continued to support investment in advanced technologies, his programs also emphasized reliability, maintainability, and operational flexibility that could adapt to changing threat environments and mission requirements. His influence had extended beyond Air Force boundaries, affecting joint service approaches to tactical aviation, and changing how military leaders understood the relationship between human factors and technological capabilities. Johnson's advocacy for cross-training programs that exposed pilots to different aircraft types and operational philosophies had improved overall military aviation effectiveness. The Special Operations community had embraced Colonel Mitchell's techniques with particular enthusiasm, recognizing their applicability to missions where conventional approaches might not be suitable or available. Brigadier General Brooks, now commanding Air Force Special Operations Command, had integrated her methods into training programs that prepared pilots for operations in denied or contested environments. Brooks' units regularly conducted exercises that simulated the kind of challenging conditions where Colonel Mitchell had developed her expertise, operating in environments where electronic warfare, communication jamming, and navigation disruption created tactical problems that couldn't be solved through technological superiority alone. These training programs had produced pilots whose capabilities extended far beyond what traditional education methods could achieve. The operational success of units trained in Colonel Mitchell's techniques had influenced special operations doctrine throughout the Department of Defense. Her emphasis on adaptability, resourcefulness, and tactical innovation had become central to preparing personnel for missions where conventional approaches might prove inadequate or counterproductive. Brooks had established exchange programs with allied military services, sharing Colonel Mitchell's insights with international partners who faced similar challenges in developing tactical aviation capabilities suited to modern operational environments. These programs had strengthened military relationships while improving collective understanding of effective air power employment under diverse conditions. At the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colonel Mitchell's story had become required study for cadets learning about leadership, tactical thinking, and the dangers of assumption-based decision-making. The case study of her red flag demonstration was used to teach future officers about recognizing excellence regardless of appearances and understanding that capability often existed in forms that didn't match expectations. Academy instructors used the Nellis incident to illustrate principles of professional respect, tactical innovation, and the importance of maintaining open minds when evaluating personnel and equipment that might not conform to conventional standards. These lessons had become central to developing officers who could lead effectively in environments where traditional approaches might not apply. The Behavioral Science Department at the Academy had conducted extensive research into the psychological factors that had led experienced pilots to misjudge Colonel Mitchell so completely. Their findings had influenced training programs throughout the military, helping personnel recognize and overcome cognitive biases that could affect professional judgment and decision-making processes. Cadet training now included scenarios designed to challenge assumptions about capability and effectiveness, ensuring that future Air Force leaders would be better prepared to recognize unconventional excellence when they encountered it. These programs had produced officers whose leadership styles emphasized substance over appearance and performance over preconceptions. The Air Force Test Center at Edwards Air Force Base had established the Mitchell Innovation Laboratory, where experimental approaches to tactical problems were developed and evaluated without the constraints of conventional thinking. The laboratory's mission reflected Colonel Mitchell's demonstration that breakthrough capabilities often emerged from unconventional combinations of existing technologies and innovative employment techniques. Test pilots assigned to the Mitchell Laboratory worked on projects that challenged fundamental assumptions about aircraft design, mission requirements, and operational effectiveness. Their research had produced tactical innovations that improved Air Force capabilities across multiple mission areas, from close air support to strategic reconnaissance operations. The laboratory's work had influenced next-generation aircraft development, ensuring that future designs incorporated lessons learned from studying how exceptional pilots could achieve remarkable results with existing equipment. These insights had improved the effectiveness of new systems while reducing development costs and complexity. Research conducted at the Mitchell Laboratory had been shared with defense contractors and allied military services, advancing collective understanding of the factors that determine tactical effectiveness in complex operational environments. The laboratory had become a model for innovation programs throughout the defense community. At Nellis Air Force Base, the Red Flag program had undergone fundamental changes that reflected lessons learned from Colonel Mitchell's demonstration. Exercise scenarios now regularly included situations where technological advantages were neutralized or compromised, forcing participants to develop tactical solutions that didn't depend on maintaining electronic superiority over adversary forces. The current Red Flag director, Colonel Harrison, had restructured training programs to emphasize adaptability and tactical innovation over strict adherence to doctrinal approaches that might not apply under all operational conditions. His exercises challenged pilots to think creatively about employing available resources effectively rather than simply following predetermined procedures. Red Flag had become a laboratory for developing tactical concepts that could remain effective when the technological assumptions underlying conventional approaches were invalidated by adversary capabilities or operational circumstances. These scenarios had improved pilot preparation for combat environments where American forces might not possess the overwhelming technological advantages they had historically relied upon. International participation in Red Flag exercises had increased significantly as allied military services sought to learn from training methods that emphasized fundamental capabilities over technological dependence. These programs had strengthened military partnerships while improving collective defense capabilities. The influence of Colonel Mitchell's demonstration had extended beyond military aviation into civilian sectors where her lessons about recognizing hidden capability and avoiding assumption-based judgments had proven applicable to business leadership, educational methods, and organizational development. Management consulting firms had developed training programs based on the Nellis incident, teaching corporate leaders about the dangers of overlooking talent that didn't conform to conventional expectations. Universities had incorporated the Colonel Mitchell case study into leadership courses, business school curricula, and organizational behavior programs. Students learned about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to identify capability and potential that might not be immediately apparent through traditional evaluation methods. The story had become popular in motivational speaking circuits where presenters used Colonel Mitchell's example to illustrate principles about overcoming prejudice, recognizing unconventional excellence, and maintaining professional dignity under difficult circumstances. These presentations had influenced approaches to diversity and inclusion programs across multiple industries. Research institutions had studied the psychological and sociological factors that contributed to the misjudgment Colonel Mitchell experienced, producing insights that had improved understanding of bias, stereotyping, and the factors that influenced professional evaluation processes. This research had informed policy development in organizations seeking to improve fairness and effectiveness in personnel assessment. The Aviation Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base had created a permanent exhibit featuring Colonel Mitchell's A-10 alongside interactive displays that allowed visitors to experience simulated versions of the navigation and tactical challenges she had mastered. The exhibit had become one of the museum's most popular attractions, drawing visitors from around the world who wanted to understand how unconventional approaches could achieve extraordinary results. The museum's educational programs used Colonel Mitchell's story to teach young people about the importance of persistence, continuous learning, and maintaining confidence in their abilities regardless of others' expectations. These programs had inspired countless students to pursue careers in aviation and aerospace engineering. Documentary filmmakers had produced award-winning features about Colonel Mitchell's career and the broader implications of her red flag demonstration. These films had reached international audiences, spreading awareness of lessons about recognizing excellence and avoiding the dangers of assumption-based thinking. The Mitchell Foundation, established with proceeds from these documentaries and related educational materials, provided scholarships for students pursuing aviation careers and funded research into improving military training methods. The foundation had become a symbol of how individual excellence could create lasting positive change. Colonel Mitchell herself had transitioned to civilian life, accepting a position as Director of Tactical Development at a leading aerospace company, where her expertise influenced the design of next-generation aircraft and training systems. Her work continued to challenge conventional thinking about the relationship between technology and operational effectiveness, ensuring that future military capabilities would reflect lessons learned from her remarkable career. Her consulting work with international military services had spread American tactical innovations globally, while providing insights into how different air forces approach the challenges of modern combat aviation. These exchanges had improved collective understanding of effective air power employment, while strengthening relationships with allied nations. The technical papers and articles Colonel Mitchell published in professional journals had become required reading for pilots, engineers, and military leaders seeking to understand how tactical innovation could overcome technological limitations. Her writing had influenced doctrinal development across multiple military services and contributed to academic understanding of military effectiveness. Speaking engagements at military academies, staff colleges, and professional conferences had allowed Colonel Mitchell to directly influence the education of future military leaders. Her presentations emphasized themes of adaptability, tactical thinking, and the importance of maintaining capabilities that transcended technological dependence. The transformation that had begun with a single demonstration at Nellis Air Force Base had fundamentally altered how the American military understood the relationship between human capability and technological advantage. Colonel Mitchell's legacy lived on in training programs, acquisition strategies, and operational doctrines that recognized the continued importance of fundamental skills and tactical innovation. Her influence had created a generation of military professionals who understood that true excellence often came in unexpected forms, and that the most dangerous assumptions were those that dismissed capability based on superficial appearances. These lessons had made American military forces more adaptable, more innovative, and better prepared for operational environments where conventional approaches might not apply. The story of Colonel Sarah Mitchell served as a permanent reminder that the most powerful weapons in any military arsenal weren't necessarily the newest or most expensive systems, but the men and women who operated them with skill, dedication, and the kind of tactical brilliance that could overcome any technological disadvantage through superior understanding and flawless execution. Her demonstration at Nellis had proven that excellence transcended appearances, that capability couldn't be judged by surface characteristics, and that the greatest victories often belonged to those who were underestimated by opponents who confused technology with competence. These lessons had become part of military culture, ensuring that future generations would be better prepared to recognize and develop the kind of exceptional talent that could determine the outcome of conflicts where national security hung in the balance. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.